So yeah, anyway, I kind of started getting into the mindset of like, well, if it's just me up on stage with my guitar, I have to be able to like sing and play. That has to be one part of the performance that needs to be compelling. But the other part is the thing that I saw so many people failing at after show, where they would just either not communicate with the audience at all, or they were painfully shy, or it was a kind of like act of like, you know, this mumbly kind of thing where they barely talk at all. And then they play too long, or, you know what I mean? I just saw every permutation of that. So the challenge that I kind of gave to myself was, I need to learn how to write better songs. I need to learn how to sing. I need to learn how to figure out what it means to like entertain people. So I came up with all these different things for the set, where I had like these, you know, cue cards, question cards that I handed out to the audience, where I would say like, ask a cult leader, you know, write down your questions, and then I would answer the questions during the show, and it started to create almost like a strange talk show kind of, you know, back and forth. And I really enjoyed that process, because I felt like, I think I did one show in New York, and my friend Mike Baggetta came up to me and he was like, dude, it was like watching like stand-up. And it kind of had turned into that, which was fun, because that felt like, well, that's entertainment, you know. But it was a very interesting thing to navigate, and I think to a certain degree I'm still navigating it, you know. I'm working on a lot of new material, but I also kind of have this thing where I just think, at least for me, I did it. That's like, I tried it. And there was a certain amount of, you know, getting back to the original thing you said about, like, is it me, or was it enough, or was it wishy-washy? There was a lot of, it was an amplified version of me.
Because what I was thinking when I asked the question is that, when you said, then I saw something manifesting in the real world, and then I thought again about what I was doing, my immediate first thought would be like, what would somebody like the Residents would do? They would double down.
Of course.
Then the character would become even more aggressive.
Right.
And he would become more theatrical,
yeah.
and there would be a mask involved.
Right.
And so that's why I thought, well, maybe he still thought that was Chris.
Yeah.
Sort of playing a character,
yeah.
and not actually committing to, because you can do three things on stage, as far as I can tell, as a performer. You can come in and say, I'm myself, I'm giving you myself, this is my authentic self. Or you can say, this is a completely theatrical experience,
yeah.
like The Residents. It's almost like you're seeing a play.
Right.
And I want to do it this way. Third way, of course, is the religious one. It's I'm accepting the idea that the stage is what it has been since the beginning of performance, which is a sacred space that is delineating a line between non-sacred space, which is where the audience is, or where the outside world is, and then this stage where we're going to invoke things that are different, the shamanic, you know, element to the stage. I remember seeing the 1990s Doors movie that Oliver Stone did with Val Kilmer, which I think is a very good. I mean, it's a bad movie in many ways, and it's also an astonishingly good movie in looking at it the other way. And then I saw actual footage of Jim Morrison from a film that the Doors put out themselves in 1968, and all the mumbo jumbo that Oliver Stone was doing with the dead Native American that walks around and all that. Once you take that away and you watch the actual performance, oh, Morrison was onto something. And this is a guy that, you know, I've gone on and off like most people who are older. You know, you love them at 17, and then at 24, you're like, what was I thinking?
Right.
But Morrison, once you do the whole equation, when you're like, yeah, he was a cheeseball, yeah, it's like sophomore poetry, you know, ranted in a self-important way. Yes, and yet he's actually shamanic in the real sense.
Interesting.
Creative. This is a very young man who's like channeling archetypes and forces that are clearly affecting the people in a very crucial way, and he's availing himself of performance on the stage to do that, to the point where you feel concerned about himself. You see that very rarely nowadays when you go to a show. The closest I've ever been to that was an illegal basement show in Boston by the band Lightning Bolt.
Oh yeah.
And Brian Chippendale tweeted recently. He said, "I finally got it. We are Lightning Bolt when we sit up in the middle of the audience, and when we sit up on stage, we're a Lightning Bolt cover band."
Interesting.
And I saw one of the shows where they were in the middle of a basement, completely surrounded by bodies, with a huge stacks of amps behind them, and that basement was shaking, and there were things happening in there, and just byproduct of the physical energy and the music coming out of that. Now that's heavy, and like you pay a price for. I don't know if you can run a studio like this and be that kind of shamanic presence. Like that takes it.
Or be a father and a husband and stuff, you know. So these are the things that I was sort of contending with a little bit, you know, like how far could I go with it?
Prince is somebody else I saw do that at the Forum in front of thousands of people, and we all know how hard it was for him to just start a family, just like keep things together. Bowie could only raise a family after retiring.
Right.
Pretty much.
You know, it's interesting, and like, I think about this a lot. You know, there's like, I was talking to my friend Andrew Pompey years ago, and he said, like, there's a kind of paradigm in classical music where a lot of early classical composers thought the music could only be rhythmically complex or melodically complex. It could not be both at the same time. Mm-hmm. You had to choose one or the other. And I thought that we're making that trade-off in lots of different things. For me, the interesting thing, only in the last maybe, I don't know, few months or something, I was sort of reminded of some of the more wildly experimental music that I had personally made. I don't know, something like, I don't know how long ago it was, but my friend Sean Carnage and I put this movie out called 40 Bands, 80 Minutes years ago, and it was a document of all these wild experimental bands in Los Angeles at the time. And my old band, I Heart Lung, is in there, and our song's like a minute and a half long, and it's just this guitar and drum kind of like interstellar space, you know, Coltrane era wannabe, you know. But it's interesting because, you know, I know a lot of people still really love that music, and it means a lot to them. And I think there was a period of time where I sort of discounted its importance because I don't sit around thinking about the past, certainly not my own. I just think, well, I did that, and now I need to do something new. I need to challenge myself to do something else. But I do think there's an interesting thing that happens where if a certain art or music hits the receiver at a certain age, it's almost like there's this indelible imprint on them, and 10 years later they still have a hard time receiving new things the way that they received that 10 years ago or 15 or 20 years ago. I mean, I've had people come up to me and say, well, when are you going to do another I Heart Lung record? Or music that I made 10 or 15 years ago means more to them than anything I'm doing now. They don't want to talk about the stuff that I do today.
Well, I had... So, I'm a huge fan of Jarvis Cocker and of the band Pulp.
Sure.
And I got an advance copy in 1996 of Different Class, and 95 or 96 thereabouts. The first time the CD came to America, I managed to get an advance copy, and I've been a fan ever since. Like, I went to the record store to buy We Love Life which is a record where nobody bought. It came out, I think, right after September 11th or something, and I bought that one. I love that album. Play it constantly. Kept up with Jarvis's career as a solo artist and as a collaborator, and I felt that We Love Life had been a great experimental departure, and it was produced by Scott Walker, who I also adore.
Oh, right.
Everything was great, and then suddenly Pulp reforms to do a reunion tour, and I was excited, and then somebody sent me a clip of the first show, and I'm like, oh shit, they're just playing different class the way that the band sounded back then. They're a Pulp cover band with the same members, which I understand because in their heyday, they never got to play America, they never got to play big stadiums here. They didn't make the money they should have made, and so Jarvis wanted to get as many fans as possible to be able to experience that, and I get that. But I was interested in what was on his mind and in his musical sense in 2010. I didn't want to hear 1997 again. Again, like what we were saying before, I think we're in the minority wanting the artists to progress.
Yeah.
People just want the artists to play.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because years ago when I put out this record called Making the Saint, which is just a solo electric guitar record with very long form pieces. And I did a solo tour on that. And I remember I played a show, I think it was in Denver, and someone came up to me after the show and said, oh, I thought you were going to play something else. Because I think, if I remember correctly, at that show, I'd actually done a few songs where I sang. And I did some weird version of, like, Don't Stand So Close to Me into We're Only Making Plans for Nigel by XTC and the Police. Because, like, they were, like, the same chord progression or something. I was just messing around with them. I was like, oh, I want to just try this thing and see if it works. But anyway, I remember someone came up to me after the show and they were like, oh, I didn't know you were going to sing so much. Like, I thought it was going to be like this. And it was a funny feeling for me, because I thought at the time, like, oh, well, it's a good thing that I don't, like, dedicate my art to your, like, the whims of any particular fan of what they want from me. And maybe that's my own cross to bear over time, because I do know that, like, my sort of, like, musical or creative restlessness is in a way my own kind of maybe my own undoing, commercially speaking. I remember years ago my friend Tom Steck, who's the drummer in I Heart Lungby, he's a great painter, and he told me that there were all of these other painters who were his contemporaries that got into these things, like they would just do like disaster paintings. And that's all they did. They would be like, yeah, here's like a Kmart getting hit by a tornado. And then the next painting is like, here's a food for less, after an earthquake. And it was just this series of, one thing after another. They were just variations on the theme. And I just thought, God, what a terrible existence to use the gift of the thing that you love and you're good at just to get money.
Well, but I think that the difference there is what the intent is. If art is hard enough, art should never be your plan B. Like, it's hard enough. If you're going to do something for money, you should do something else for money. Right. And then do the art. You shouldn't. So, to me, the big difference is that if these people thought cynically about it and were doing it in a way where they really would rather be doing something else, but were doing that for money, versus if they thought that that's what they wanted to do at the time, they wanted to do nothing but disaster paintings. To me, what we think of them is not as important as what do they think that they're doing with their time.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I would say, let's say, 10 years later, if you look back at that artist's work and they're still doing that, I see this in music all the time, right? Where it's just sort of like, okay, they started doing this, time passes, they still just are doing mostly the same thing. You know,
But they're doing it. They're doing music. You know, that's what I mean. Like, don't compare that to a work of art that doesn't exist, which is what in your mind they should be doing. Compare it to them not doing anything at all.
I might prefer that.
Well,
I guess what I'm saying is, like, I look at each record as like, or you know, each day, in fact, is like an opportunity to do something new, and I think that there is an actual transaction that takes place. I think if you choose to do, let's say, work that is below your creative station, you're at some point what you're doing is you're trading the muse for money. And I think at a point the muse will leave and you won't be able to get it back, or at least not for a while. And I think even different big artists have had that happen to them. You know, I think different folks. There's a reason that, you know, an artist sort of comes on this upswing. They do a lot of work that seems like vital and important and sincere. They hit a certain kind of, like, you know, mass, and then it's this kind of like swift downward spiral. And I think part of that is because, you know, other people come into the equation, things get complicated, managers, record labels, different folks say, we need you to do this, we need you to do that. Well, then you stop making decisions based on, like, your own internal compass. You know, this is something that, for all of his, you know, faults, I've always loved about Dylan, you know.
Yeah.
My son and I saw him, maybe a year or so ago, at the Shrine. And
Yeah, I saw that show.
And it was, I felt like part of it was totally confounding, you know, like he played a bunch of tunes that, like, I didn't even particularly like, and I felt like he sort of mumbled his way through them. And then he played, like, all those, like, standards, and he sounded amazing, like beautiful, like, phrasing, and, you know, I thought his voice sounded beautiful and really interesting ensemble. You know, he had, like, the pedal steel was, like, very forward and front in the whole band. And then he did some kind of, like, crazy sped up version of a tune off Blood on the Tracks, and I was just kind of like, man, I love that this guy is still confounding his audience today.
Well,
he could have taken the path of least resistance and gone out there and said, you guys want the hits, here's all the hits, and everybody would have adored him for it.
I get dumbfounded when talking about Dylan because I'm one of those people. You know those people. And so I disagree with pretty much everything that you said. I don't find it confounding at all. And I think that everything about the shamanic state that I said before, we're talking about somebody who has been consistently in that state for about 55 years.
Yeah.
I listen to a lot of Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
A lot. I listen to things that are released. I listen to things that are dug up and released as bootleg series. I listen to actual bootlegs. I listen to stuff that is unreleased that maybe he completely forgot that he did. I listen to a lot of Bob Dylan. And I can't agree with anything you said because I was at that show and my experience is, first of all, my experience has always been, even before the Nobel Prize, is like, okay, I'm living in Shakespeare's time and I get to go see a Shakespeare play with Shakespeare playing parts on it.
Yeah.
So I will go see a Bob Dylan show anytime because we are lucky to be living at the time when that person whose work is going to survive for 500 years or more is right there. You can see him. You can be in the same environment as he is. Shakespeare's contemporaries had that feeling about Shakespeare. When you read the poems that they wrote after he died, they were saying, yeah, he was like on another level. His talent was something that wasn't like us, or Mozart and Salieri, etc. You can name, there's a different level at which he's operating, and I understand musically and lyrically and tonally what he's doing. I think I do, and I accept it, but it begins with a complete acceptance of, with complete understanding of who he is. I can also enjoy a Paul McCartney show. Paul McCartney does what Jarvis Cocker did. Paul McCartney plays Helter Skelter exactly like the record.
Right.
And I know he's not cynical about it.
Yeah.
I know he's like, well, this is what the show is, and then I'll play some of the new ones.
Right.
I can enjoy that because he's coming from that place. I also enjoy what Dylan does because I know that from the moment he came out of the box, he's done what he wanted. I've heard shows of him when he was like 19. Complete command of the performance. And I've heard shows from him from the ages of 19 till now. He's, 75 or something. Pretty much every year. And I get what he's doing. There's some shows, 87, 88, where his voice is shot, he's uncomfortable being there, and it's just an amazing documentary of a man who's just trying to find what the next step is when the world of music is demanding so much of him. There is shows from 2012 that are interesting, and then suddenly a show from 2016, like he nails a weird arrangement. He started doing this year an arrangement of When I Pay My Masterpiece, changing the lyrics.
Right.
He has countless versions of Tangled Up in Blues with different sets of lyrics.
Yeah.
And they all make sense, and they all make sense in a different way.
Right.
From a different point of view, as say. So, to me, it's hard to talk about, even though I talked about Dylan for the last 3-4 minutes, it's hard to talk about him because the ultimate word about Dylan was said by Elvis Presley, who was recording something else. He's in the recording studio, and then suddenly he sings like 2 bars of I Shall Be Released and goes, Dylan, man. Dylan, man. I know we sound culty when we talk about that, me and my ilk of people who have taken an interest in his work, but yeah, no.
Well, the funny thing for me is that what I loved about that performance was that it, not that I was necessarily like unsettled by it, but that it wasn't altogether pleasing. That's what I liked about it. I didn't feel like it was a here's a greatest hits package. I felt like in his 70s, he's still searching. He's still looking for something. And in fact, it almost seemed like he had baked into the cake that he would frustrate half of the audience by doing the standards and then songs from, I don't know, maybe like Love and Theft or something like that. I don't remember.
I personally, I don't want to speak for him, but based on reading his interviews and listening to him and getting an idea from paying attention to his life, I don't think I'm going to please the audience or I'm going to vex the audience is a thought that crosses his mind at any point in preparing a performance.
Yeah.
I don't. I think he does what he does. Life, I'm going to quote the guy, a favorite quote by him. Life is sad. Life is a bust. All you can do is do what you must. You do what you must, and you do it well. I do it for you, honey, baby, can't you tell? All you can do is do what you must. And he's been doing that. And he hasn't stopped. And he knew that right out of the box. That's why I say he's like Shakespeare. Mm-hmm. He knew that at 19. There's stuff that he's doing in the first album that is so sophisticated in terms of his point of view and his... that, you know, he's grown, he's matured, he's gone through life, he's suffered, but that point of view was there at the beginning, and it's there now.
It's interesting. I mean, you're not going to pull me into an argument about his brilliance. I totally agree with you on that. However, I would say that the flip side of that to me is that he's not like he's not. It's nothing. He doesn't have just this kind of like immutable perfection to everything he does. I think it's fascinating to look at like the sort of like the grand scale of like the work that he's done and the periods of work and the reinvention, and I love all of that. But like we were talking about earlier, you sort of need you need contrast, right? Like you don't know how good a record like Blood on the Tracks is unless you have a record that comes a few years later. I don't know, maybe some people might say like Street Legal or something like that, to say like, oh, or even what was it, Slow Train Coming, to me, like a record like that should have been like a no-brainer. But I have a hard time listening to it for certain reasons, even though it was like made in Muscle Shoals with a ton of musicians that I liked. There's stuff about the production I don't like. So my ear is kind of like pulled into different directions, and maybe like as a producer I'm critical of more things than someone who just says like, let it wash over me and I'll sort it out. This is part of what makes life difficult. You can only imagine being a member of my family, to have to sit at the dinner table every night and have someone say, here's an opinion I have, and then Dad pops up and is like, well, let me tell you about why this is wrong, or whatever. But I think for me, the beautiful thing about watching someone like Dylan or Joni Mitchell, I think there's only a handful of people who have done this over and over again, where they just continue to reinvent themselves.
But somebody like Bowie, he was talked about it. I think that there was a deliberate intention to reinvent himself. Mm-hmm. Most of the people that you're mentioning, if you talk about Leonard Cohen or Joni Mitchell or Dylan, I frankly don't think that also is in any. They never sit on a couch and go, geez, it's time to reinvent myself.
Yeah, I would probably agree with that, but I do think that each of those artists has this is sort of my point. Mm. It's the muse. It's the muse says, let's keep moving. Let's bring some new musicians in. Let's go to a different geographic location. They keep doing these things over and over, not because if they stay in the same place, they become inert, no matter how brilliant they are. Dylan couldn't just keep working with Tom Wilson in Columbia, right? He had to keep doing other things. He had to keep working with other people, bring different musicians in, try different arrangements, seek out different mentors, and you know what I mean? Like, these people need, I always think of that Neil Young lyric from Will to Love, he needs the water to flow over his gills. That's kind of the thing that I think you see a lot of these great artists do over and over again. They need to, they have they have this kind of like urge. They have to keep moving.
Or because I'm thinking also about in terms of rootedness, like Dylan with the folk and Johnny with jazz, and Leonard Cohen with his spirituality. They are actually rooted to a place, and the world keeps. You can look at it as the world is the one that keeps moving, yeah. And they're rooted to a place, and they have to interact with that moving. There's still, but there's two moving trains next to them, mm-hmm. And they have to keep bouncing that steadiness. I'm thinking about Dylan. There's a period some people don't like in the mid to late 80s, where clearly to me what he's trying to do is like he's heard a lot of Bruce Springsteen and seen the crowds and says, I'm going to try to do something like that. Bowie did that too. There's a couple of records where there's stuff where they're clearly listening to Bruce Springsteen and saying, he's a talented, smart guy, and he's being incredibly successful. So maybe I should try something like that.
Yeah. Or maybe someone at their record label has pushed them in that direction.
I don't think they. I think they probably has somebody running interference with a record label. I think it's them. I believe it's them.
I mean, I always think of. I don't know if you ever saw that Bogdanovich documentary about Tom Petty, but there's this really brilliant moment where like Petty's in the studio with Roger McGowan from the Byrds, and there's an A&R guy in there telling him like what to do, and Tom Petty goes like, "Dude, did you write 8 Miles High?" You know, like, shut the fuck up. Don't talk to him. Don't tell him anything. And I think there's a dearth of people like that in the world. When you get into a certain kind of like holding pattern of like, yes, I've had some success, but I don't know where the next hit is going to come from. You sort of open the door to all of these yes men and, you know, career, you know, industry people to start saying, let's try this, let's try that.
No, maybe.
Yeah. You know, it actually makes me think of another artist that I kind of wanted to mention to you, because we were talking about some of these things on the periphery, and that's Paul Simon. I don't know if you're a Paul Simon fan or not, but I just finished this biography about him by Peter Ames Carlin that was really good. I've always had a bit of a love-hate relationship with Paul Simon, and one of the things that I always thought was difficult for me to reconcile was Graceland. And the fact that like so much of this music is clearly like not his music. And I thought it was kind of fascinating because the book does a good job of kind of going back to the beginning of his career. And from his the first song on his first solo record is Mother and Child Reunion. And to make that song, he went to Jamaica and recorded in Kingston at the studio where all the guys were making the great like reggae tunes at the time, hired those guys, and it was almost like a blueprint of what he would do years later with Graceland. In fact, he did a similar thing with like Stéphane Grappelli, the great jazz violinist. They did just sort of like a little jam. It's on the record, and it's to say that it's like a Paul Simon song would be silly, but you know, he got publishing on it. So it's an interesting thing because I think Paul Simon is someone who's done a similar thing. He's literally gone. He went to Muscle Shoals. He did that with Ryman Simon.